the dark history of the Vikings. Sometime around the year 750, in the dense forests along the fjords of western Norway and the flat coastlines of what is now Denmark, craftsmen began building something the world had never seen. Not a weapon, not a fortress, a boat. And that boat would change the course of European history more profoundly than any army, any king, or any war that came before it. The men who built it did not call themselves Vikings. That word, in the old Norse language they spoke, simply meant a seaborne raider, a job description, not an identity. Most of the people of Scandinavia were farmers, blacksmiths, traders, and craftsmen who never left their home valleys. But the ones who did leave carried with them a piece of engineering so advanced for its time that it gave a relatively small number of men the ability to strike anywhere in Europe at any moment, with almost no warning at all. The ship was called the Longship. Its construction method, known as clinker-built, used overlapping oak planks riveted together in a way that made the hull flexible rather than rigid. Where a conventional ship would crack and splinter against the waves of the North Sea, the Longship flexed and rode, absorbing the impact and moving with the water rather than against it. The result was a vessel that could cross open ocean and yet draw less than 1 meter of water, shallow enough to beach directly on a riverbank or a mudflat, shallow enough to navigate inland rivers hundreds of miles from the sea. Dragon heads carved from oak were mounted on the bows. A single sail, combined with banks of oars, gave the Longship a top speed estimated at 15 to 17 knots, faster than anything the navies of England, France, or the Frankish Empire could put in the water. Here is the question that historians have debated for 3 centuries. What made a largely agricultural society in the frozen north suddenly decide to point those ships southward? What made an island monastery off the coast of England, isolated, peaceful, and devoted entirely to prayer, suddenly look like a target? The answer would arrive on a specific morning in June of 793, and nothing in Europe would ever be the same. Dragon ships strike the holy island of Lindisfarne. On the morning of June 8th, 793, on a small tidal island off the northeast coast of England in the Kingdom of Northumbria, the monks of the monastery of Lindisfarne were going about the rhythms of their day, prayer, manuscript work, tending the grounds, when shapes appeared on the horizon. Low in the water, fast, decorated with carved animal heads on their bows, moving directly toward the island with no hesitation, and no attempt at communication. Lindisfarne was not chosen at random. It was the most important center of Christianity in all of Northumbria, home to the relics of St. Cuthbert, patron saint of northern England, and the source of the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most magnificent illuminated manuscripts produced anywhere in the Western world up to that point. Its spiritual prestige made it extraordinarily wealthy in sacred objects, gold and silver liturgical items, stored food, and livestock. Its location on a tidal island made it geographically accessible by sea and entirely undefended by walls, soldiers, or any military presence whatsoever. The raiders were almost certainly from the western coast of Scandinavia, western Norway, or northern Denmark. They came ashore without warning. The monastery had no defenses. Monks were killed inside the church, thrown into the sea to drown, or seized and dragged back to the ships in chains. The gold was taken. The silver was taken. The sacred objects accumulated over more than a century of devotion were loaded into longships and carried north across the North Sea. The prayer that began circulating through the monasteries of Europe in the months that followed was written in Latin, A furore Normanorum libera nos, Domine. From the fury of the Northmen, Lord, deliver us. What made the attack so traumatic was not only the violence, it was the theological implication. Sacred spaces in 8th century Europe were understood to be under divine protection. The fact that pagan raiders from an unknown northern shore could walk into the sanctuary of Saint Cuthbert, kill his monks, steal his treasures, and sail away without being struck down by the hand of God sent a shock wave of religious doubt and existential terror through every Christian kingdom on the continent. Europe had been sleeping. It was now awake. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. Vikings turn human beings into tradable commodities. The gold and silver taken from Lindisfarne was only one category of plunder. The other category walked on two legs, could be fed cheaply during the sea voyage north, and could be sold in markets from Dublin to Baghdad for prices that made the raid economically rational, even when the church treasures were modest. The Vikings did not merely raid for objects. They raided for people. The system had a name in Old Norse: thraldom. A thrall was a slave, and the Viking economy was built around their capture, transport, and sale to an extent that modern scholarship has steadily revised upward as more evidence emerges from archaeological sites and medieval chronicles across 3 continents. The scale was significant. One estimate places thralls at approximately 10% of the total population of Viking-era Scandinavia, meaning that roughly 1 in 10 people living in the Norse homelands had been forcibly brought there from somewhere else. The Irish annals of Ulster record more than 100 Viking raids on Ireland alone before the year 900. In 821, the annals recorded that Howth, County Dublin, was attacked and, in their precise words, a great booty of women was carried away. Dublin itself, established as a Norse trading base in 841, became the largest slave market in the British Isles. Excavations in Dublin have uncovered heavy iron chains designed to be locked around a person's neck during transport. Irish men, women, and children were sold to buyers in Iceland, where Celtic DNA studies show that Gaelic people formed approximately 40% of the island's founding population, and to buyers in Anatolia, the Islamic Caliphate, and the Byzantine Empire. The trade routes ran from Limerick in Ireland to Baghdad in modern Iraq, and from the Norwegian port of Kaupang to Constantinople, following the great river systems of Eastern Europe. Furs, amber, and walrus ivory traveled east. Silver dirhams minted in the Islamic world traveled west. And between these luxury goods, moving in both directions along the same routes, were human beings taken from coastal communities across Britain, Ireland, France, and the Slavic interior of Europe. The desire for slaves was not a byproduct of Viking raiding. For many expeditions, it was the primary purpose. A pagan army arrives to conquer all England. In the year 865, something changed. For the previous 72 years, the raids had followed a pattern: fast, focused, and temporary. A fleet appeared, hit a monastery or a coastal town, loaded whatever could be moved, and left before any organized military response could form. But in the autumn of 865, a force landed in East Anglia that had not come to raid. It had come to stay. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it the Mickle Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. It was led, according to both English records and Norse sagas, by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, a semi-legendary Danish chieftain who had raided England and France for decades. The 3 principal commanders named in the sources were Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba. Whether motivated by vengeance for their father's alleged death at the hands of the Northumbrian king Ella, who supposedly executed Ragnar by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes, or simply by the overwhelming economic opportunity England represented, these 3 men assembled the largest Scandinavian invasion force England had ever faced. The army's first move was strategic brilliance. King Edmund of East Anglia, rather than fight, provided them with horses. The Vikings promptly became a mounted force capable of striking deep into the interior of England at a speed no defending army could match. By the autumn of 866, they had captured York, then the second most important city in England, exploiting an ongoing civil war between two rival Northumbrian kings. Both kings, Osbert and Ella, were killed trying to retake the city the following spring. Over the next 13 years, the army systematically dismantled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia. They introduced the winter settle, permanent winter encampments rather than seasonal withdrawals, transforming from sea raiders into a year-round land army. By 875, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained unconquered. Its name was Wessex, and its king was 22 years old. One king hides in a swamp to save everything. In January of 878, the Danish warlord Guthrum launched a surprise attack on the royal estate at Chippenham in Wiltshire, in the heart of the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The attack came in midwinter, after the Christmas season, when the King of Wessex had believed the campaign season was over. King Alfred escaped with his personal bodyguard and a handful of loyal thanes. He fled into the Somerset Levels, a vast, flooded marshland where the winter waters made movement almost impossible for anyone who did not know the ground, and essentially vanished. Alfred was 28 years old. He had been king for 7 years, inheriting a kingdom already under siege. The man who would later be the only English monarch in history, given the title the Great, was hiding in a swamp, reportedly burning a peasant woman's cakes while distracted by military planning, while the Danes occupied his capital and most of Wessex submitted or fled. What followed over the next 4 months was one of the most remarkable military comebacks in medieval history. Alfred used the marshes of Athelney as a guerrilla base, conducting hit-and-run raids on Danish forces and sending messengers to the Fyrd, the citizen militia, across Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. In the 7th week after Easter, in May of 878, he rode out to a meeting point at Egbert's Stone in Wiltshire. The men of 3 counties came to him. He marched north. At Edington in Wiltshire, he confronted Guthrum's army in open battle. Alfred's forces advanced in dense shield wall formation and drove the Danes back into their fortified position at Chippenham. Alfred besieged the position for 2 weeks. Starved and exhausted, Guthrum sued for peace. The terms Alfred demanded were extraordinary. Guthrum would be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred as his godfather. Guthrum accepted. The 2 men spent 12 days feasting together at Wedmore in Somerset, while the ceremony was performed. England was formally divided. The north and east fell under what became known as the Danelaw. Wessex survived. Alfred began building the network of fortified towns that would become the foundation of the English nation. Viking longships sail up the River Seine to Paris. In March of 845, a fleet of 120 Viking longships entered the mouth of the River Seine and began moving upstream toward the heart of the Frankish Empire. The fleet carried more than 5,000 warriors. Their commander was a Norse chieftain named Regenerus, identified in later Norse sagas as Ragnar Lodbrok, though whether this was the same figure remains historically disputed. What is not disputed is what happened when the fleet reached the city of Paris. The Frankish Empire in 845 was a weakened and fractured version of the domain Charlemagne had ruled. His grandsons were fighting each other for territory in civil wars that consumed the military resources that might otherwise have defended the coast. King Charles the Bald ruler of West Francia, scrambled to respond. He assembled an army and divided it into two forces, one on each bank of the Seine, a decision that proved disastrous since the Vikings simply attacked whichever half was weaker at any given moment. They seized 111 prisoners and hanged them on an island in the Seine, in full view of the surviving Frankish forces. The psychological effect was calculated and devastating. Paris, at that time a relatively modest city centered on the Ile de la Cité, had no significant fortifications and could not be defended. The Vikings arrived on Easter Sunday, March 29th, and plundered the city. Charles paid a ransom of 7,000 French livres, approximately 2,570 kilograms of gold and silver, to secure their withdrawal. It was the first of 13 such payments that Frankish rulers would make to Viking leaders over the following decades. Each payment bought temporary peace and confirmed for every Viking chieftain in Scandinavia that Paris was accessible, wealthy, and worth returning to. The Second Siege of Paris, from November of 885 to October of 886, brought a fleet estimated at more than 700 vessels and tens of thousands of warriors. The Danes were eventually paid off again, this time with 700 pounds of silver and permission to plunder the rebellious region of Burgundy. Europe had learned an expensive lesson about the cost of weakness. A warlord trades his sword for a French dukedom. By the early 10th century, one Viking chieftain had made himself impossible to ignore or remove. His name in the Norse sagas was Hrolf Ganger, Hrolf the Walker, a man reportedly so large that no horse could carry him, and he had to walk everywhere. The Frankish sources called him Rollo. He had been operating in the Seine Valley for years, using the area around Rouen as his permanent base, raiding Saint-Lô, Bayeux, and Paris at will. No Frankish king had been able to dislodge him. In June of 911, Rollo laid siege to Chartres, a significant city approximately 50 miles southwest of Paris. He was defeated in July by a Frankish force under Robert, Count of Paris. Weakened, but still formidable, Rollo found himself at a negotiating table with the Frankish king, Charles the Simple. What they agreed to at the small town of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, on the road between Rouen and Paris, was one of the most consequential territorial deals in European history. Charles ceded to Rollo and his followers all the land between the river Epte and the sea, roughly the area of what is now Upper Normandy, including the city of Rouen. In exchange, Rollo swore fealty to Charles as his overlord, converted to Christianity, married Charles's daughter Gisela, and committed to defending the lower Seine against raids by other Viking groups. The Duchy of Normandy, from the Latin Normani, men of the north, was born. What followed over the next 4 generations was one of history's most complete cultural transformations. The Norse settlers adopted the French language, married into the local Frankish population, converted to Christianity, and built one of the most militarily capable feudal states in the Western Europe. Rollo's great-great-great-grandson was William, Duke of Normandy. In October of 1066, William crossed the English Channel and defeated the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. The descendants of the men who had terrorized France for over a century were now kings of England. Norse explorers reached North America 5 centuries early. Around the year 985, a Norse settler named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland, where Eric the Red had recently established the first permanent Norse colony. When his ship was blown off course by storms, he sighted an unfamiliar coastline to the west, covered in forests with no mountains or glaciers visible. He turned north and eventually reached Greenland without setting foot on the new land. But he described what he had seen, and his account reached the ears of Eric the Red's son. Leif Erikson departed from Greenland around the year 1000. Following the reverse of Bjarni's route, he passed a land of flat stones he called Helluland, almost certainly Baffin Island, then a forested coastline he called Markland, almost certainly southern Labrador, and finally reached a land of meadows, wild grapes, and rivers running with salmon. He called it Vinland. He built shelters and wintered there before returning to Greenland with a cargo of timber, a resource the treeless island desperately needed. The archaeological confirmation came in 1960 when Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at the northern tip of Newfoundland in Canada, at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows. Excavations over the following decades revealed 3 communal longhouses, a smithy with an iron-smelting furnace, a carpentry workshop, and a boat repair yard. In 2021, scientists using tree ring analysis of wooden artifacts found at the site determined with precise certainty that Viking axes had cut those trees in the year 1021. Exactly 1,000 years before the study was published. The settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows was used for less than a decade. Conflicts with the indigenous inhabitants, the Norse called Skraelings, a generic term covering multiple Native American peoples, made permanent occupation impossible. The Norse withdrew. North America would not see European settlement again for nearly 500 more years. Swedish Vikings found the nation that becomes Russia. While Norwegian and Danish Vikings were raiding west toward England, Ireland, and France, a third branch of the Norse expansion was moving east, primarily from the region of eastern Sweden around Roslagen. These men, known to the Slavic and Greek populations they encountered as Varangians, or Rus, followed a different route entirely. They paddled south through the river networks of Eastern Europe, portaging their lightweight longships overland between watersheds, moving down the Dnieper and Volga rivers toward the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and ultimately the richest city in the medieval world, Constantinople. According to the 12th century Russian chronicle known as the Primary Chronicle, in 862, a Slavic tribal confederation invited a Varangian chieftain named Rurik to come and rule them. The document records their appeal in precise terms. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Rurik settled at Novgorod. In 882, his kinsman Oleg captured Kiev on the Dnieper River, declared it the mother of Rus cities, and established the state that historians call Kievan Rus, the political ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The trade route these Swedish Vikings controlled connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, passing through Novgorod and Kiev, and continued to Constantinople. Along this route flowed furs, amber, honey, wax, and slaves northward to Scandinavia. Silk, spices, and Islamic silver coins southward from Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Volga route carried goods as far as Baghdad. In 860, a Varangian fleet attacked Constantinople itself before eventually being bought off with generous trade concessions. By the late 10th century, the Norse ruling class of Kievan Rus had intermarried so thoroughly with the local Slavic population that Rurik's great-great-grandson Vladimir had a Slavic name. In 988, Vladimir converted his entire kingdom to Orthodox Christianity. The connection to Scandinavia was severed culturally, but the political entity these Swedish adventurers had built endured for centuries. A Swedish law from the 11th century had to explicitly forbid Norse men from inheriting property while residing in Greece, their term for the Byzantine Empire, because so many were emigrating east to serve in the Varangian Guard, the imperial bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors. The last great Viking dies at Stamford Bridge. In September of 1066, 300 Viking ships crossed the North Sea from Norway and entered the Humber estuary on the northeast coast of England. Their commander was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a man described by contemporaries as one of the most formidable warriors of the age, who had fought in Kievan Rus, served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard in Constantinople, and ruled Norway since 1046 through a combination of military genius and absolute ruthlessness. His epithet, Hardrada, meant hard ruler in Old Norse. Hardrada's invasion fleet carried approximately 11,000 men. He was joined at the Humber by Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the newly crowned English king Harold Godwinson, who brought additional ships and forces. On September 20th, their combined army defeated the English earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford, outside York. York surrendered. Hardrada believed the north of England was his. Harold Godwinson had been in the south, watching the channel for an expected invasion from Normandy. On learning of Hardrada's landing, he assembled his forces and marched approximately 300 miles north in just 9 days, a logistical achievement the medieval chroniclers recorded with open astonishment. He arrived at Stamford Bridge, east of York, on the morning of September 25th. The Viking army was resting in the September heat on the far bank of the River Derwent. It was a warm day. They had left their chainmail and most of their armor with the ships at Rickhall, 7 miles away. The English attacked before Hardrada's men could prepare. A single Viking warrior reportedly held the narrow bridge long enough for the main force to form a shield wall. Medieval accounts claim he killed more than 40 English soldiers with a two-handed axe before being cut down. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody. Harold Hardrada was killed by an arrow through the throat. Tostig died alongside him. Of the 300 ships that had crossed the North Sea, only 24 carried enough survivors to warrant sailing home to Norway. 3 days later, on September 28th, William of Normandy, great-great-great-grandson of the Viking chieftain Rollo, landed his invasion fleet on the south coast of England at Pevensey, Sussex. He defeated and killed Harold Godwinson at Hastings on October 14th. The Viking Age ended not with a Scandinavian triumph, but with the conquest of England by men who, just 4 generations earlier, had been Vikings themselves.